Lydia sat on the bed facing the window. She was breathing hard and fast and needed a moment to gather her thoughts in all the excitement. She stood up and took in the room. Then she made for the bathroom to check herself over. She achieved an incredible rush from seeing her reflection. The connection between herself and the lady in the mirror wasn't at all certain. Who was this creature that now stood before her? She pondered the question in delicious silence. Lydia was a head-turner for sure. She was 5 foot 6 inches tall with long jet black hair and a slim physique. She had clearly looked after her body. She had just turned 40, and she had never felt better. The lady made her way back to the bedroom where the thick smell of sexual passion hung heavy on the air. Lydia's erstwhile lover lay flat on his back on the right side of the bed, his arms at his sides, his legs straight and his toes curled, his eyes and mouth still open, frozen in the last moment of life. Lydia had dispatched him using his own tie, which was still around his neck. His real name was not known to Lydia. He had told her she would call him Harry when they started communicating. She liked that name and felt it suited him. Lydia lay next to her Harry, on her side, with her knees bent, leaning on her right elbow so she was elevated slightly above him. She caressed his face and lost herself in his eyes. The moment was intoxicating, yet tinged with a profound sadness. She wanted a small part of him to remain with her and enjoy this final goodbye. What were his final thoughts, she wondered? What did he feel in the moment before all feeling was lost forever? His eyes were difficult to read. Was he terrified or lost in ecstasy in the seconds before she shut him down? She hoped the latter was true. Lydia got dressed and left without a shower. She could get cleaned up later. She had no appointments for the rest of the day, so she could go home, have some wine, listen to a little music, and slowly unwind. She soaked in the bath, sipping on a glass of Chile's finest red. Lydia stared forward at these sky-blue tiles on the wall. She felt very little. In a week or so, she would seek out another partner, another seeker of the ultimate high. But first she would return to work. One must keep up appearances. Detective Chief Inspector Simon Fields sat with his assistant, Inspector Terry Hughes, in an unmarked car a couple of doors down from the home of a young man wanted for a serious assault. The kid had badly beaten a guy who had raped his best friend in a nearby flat. Him and his friend were rent boys and known to the authorities. Hunters getting a little rough from time to time was to be expected. Occasionally things got out of hand. Fields had dealt with the fallout from incidents like this one many times before. He was a veteran vice cop who was tired of his job and all that it entailed. The youthful enthusiasm of his lovely assistant, Miss Hughes, was not rubbing off on him. This was a stakeout of sorts. Terry talked about how they were going to take the kid when he emerged. Fields offered cautious and conditional approval to the young inspector's suggestions. Simon liked Terry and had asked the superintendent to arrange this partnership. As you might expect, he saw in her a reflection of his younger self, but by no means a perfect reflection. He saw in her a good deal more common sense and warmth than he had at age 25. Terry had a young son of 2 years old who was the apple of her eye. She was engaged to a kind man with good prospects. She viewed Simon as generally a decent sort of bloke, but she also saw a victim of his upbringing and social conditioning. He could be a bigoted arsehole sometimes, but she didn't really hold it against him. She respected his experience and sharp wit. He was, for her, a fairly sound professional role model. Their target, Alex, finally came out, and as luck would have it, he walked swiftly towards them. Inspector Hughes stepped out of the passenger side and addressed the suspect formally. Alex was not surprised, nor did he offer any resistance. She opened up the back door and ushered him into the vehicle. Fields regarded Alex in the mirror while Inspector Hughes turned around so she could look the young man in his eyes. "You're in a lot of trouble, Alex, mate," said the little Welsh woman. She continued, "Your victim is still in the hospital, broken jaw, punctured lung. You did quite a number on the horrible pervert." Alex allowed himself a little smile. "I've got nothing to hide. I'm happy to tell you everything I know about this cunt, and everything I did to him," said Alex. "Proud of yourself, son?" interrupted Fields. Alex answered in the affirmative without hesitation. "You're going to do a couple of years for this, Alex, no question. For what it's worth, and off the record, of course, the bastard had it coming. Well known to us he is," said the inspector, as he stared off into the distance. "But I bet the fucker's going to get away with what he did to Jake, isn't he? And save me the difficult-to-prove bullshit, please. Take me in and book me. I did him over. You will get a full confession, and I'll do porridge for a couple of years. Mr. Rapist will probably make a full recovery, and will most likely be back to his old tricks soon enough. Ain't life grand?" Alex leaned back and exhaled loudly, following his little rant. Simon and Terry exchanged glances and smirks before telling the young man to buckle up. As they made for the station, Alex began to cry. The tears were not for himself or what awaited him. His pity for poor Jake now overwhelmed him. Simon and Terry said nothing. Sarah Barker sat in a leather chair opposite her therapist and babbled on about her husband Ken. Sarah was an anxious woman who lived to please those around her. She had only just started therapy recently. This was only her third session. Whatever this was, she felt it was working. She had a lot to get off her chest, it seemed, far more than she had imagined. She was proud of herself for opening up in this way to a professional. Lydia nodded along, making reassuring noises as Sarah talked and gesticulated. The therapist felt as if she should be guiding her patient away from the subject of her significant other, and maybe start to explore the father. The session was nearing its end when Lydia interjected and tactfully suggested a change of subject for the next meeting. Sarah was a little taken aback by this, but acquiesced all the same. She was shown to the door with a kindly smile and soft hand on the shoulder. After Sarah had exited, Lydia sat back down in the comfy therapist's chair and breathed a tired sigh. Pretending to care can be exhausting sometimes, she thought. She used to find her work so rewarding, used to be so much more interesting. What changed? Lydia was fond of reminding herself that she knew too much. Not about everything, of course, but too much about people. She didn't find all human beings to be a bore. She was very much aware that there were many fascinating specimens still out there waiting to meet her. She needed new encounters, but she had to be cautious moving forward. She didn't want the game to end, not yet anyway. And when it did come to a conclusion, it would be on her terms. In the next few days, She would begin the search for a new man, a brave and honest man worthy of the gift she offered. Lydia's secretary knocked on the door and informed her boss she was going to lunch. She asked if Lydia would like to join her. The therapist chose not to reply. Chester was a clean and well-to-do city on the whole. Very bourgeoisie, one might say. Which isn't to say violent crime didn't occur here and there, but this was different. 2 murders in quick succession. The murderer had left a note to the police in both cases. These were not crimes of passion in the traditional sense. The cops were dealing with a sex killer who clearly saw their work as artistic. First had been Dominic Reed, a 26-year-old shop assistant who had been found dead in his 1-bedroom flat 2 weeks ago. He was found naked with his hands bound behind him. He was sprawled across a chair with a plastic bag taped over his head. The police were tipped off in a phone call that couldn't be traced. Now, Detective Chief Inspector Simon Fields, Inspector Terry Hughes and the forensics team were on the scene at the home of one Sean Martins, another young and single male living alone in modest accommodation. Sean had been strangled using a tie. He had been dead a while. A similar tip-off had been made. The message was the same handwriting as before. The note made reference to a site on the dark web, which neither of our inspectors had heard of before. They knew of the dark web, of course. Both Fields and Hughes had taken advantage of software allowing for online anonymity in past investigations, but it was hard work to track criminals down online, at least those who had taken the necessary precautions. Sean Martin's laptop would be taken away and checked over by the authorities, just as Dominic Reed's was. Various fingerprints found at Reed's place had been fed through the database. A couple of Dominic's former friends had been brought in and asked a few questions, but not one was a serious suspect. The initial sight of Sean Martin's body had made Terry feel quite unwell. This feeling persisted for the remainder of the day. Fields and Hughes went back to the office to discuss possible lines of inquiry. They would have to talk to friends, family, and co-workers of the deceased, of course, but they agreed this might not lead anywhere useful. They had to go through the motions anyway. This dark web site would have to be investigated thoroughly. This was a means to gaining an insight into the killer's mind and motivation. Fields was confident about this, but the inspector wasn't so confident about the prospects of catching this person before they struck again. Fields and Hughes had concluded that the killer was most likely female, highly educated, and may prove to be extremely crafty. This was the kind of challenge that Terry Hughes relished. Simon Fields, this was stimulating in a very different way. Greg Hopkins was kind of a loner. He wasn't massively keen on interacting with people too much. He was studying medicine at university but had no real career plans. In fact, he had no long or medium-term plans to speak of. He was a fatalist who had resigned himself to what he saw as his inevitable demise. Physically, he was in the prime of his life. A young man in his mid-20s, no drug or alcohol problems. One might think he had it all to look forward to. But Mr. Hopkins was fixated with the idea of his own death. As he saw it, life itself was a bad joke, a grim struggle which could not be morally justified. He was going to check out early, as fate determined. His path and destination were set. For the past few months, Greg had been immersed in dark web circles. Almost anything was possible in the murky depths of the internet, he had learned. Anonymity was almost entirely a given, but one could never be 100% sure. You couldn't be entirely sure who you were dealing with at any given time. Greg was using a site called Flagitious Times to establish the contact he was searching for. Weeks had passed with no real success. He had spoken with several like-minded individuals, but nothing had come of it. However, from the first exchanges with a user called Your Last Lover, Greg was confident he had found the person he was looking for. This did not seem like a time waster, he thought. This surely wasn't a troll or a cop. He had asked his intended probing questions. The answers he got pushed all the right buttons. Greg was not interested in any S&M bullshit. He didn't want to be beaten or humiliated. Greg had a certain condition that academics might call autosassinophilia. This meant he was turned on by the thought or threat of being killed. Not just any circumstance would do, though. Not just any woman would do either. The scene had to be just right. The method and manner of the work were similarly important. Your Last Lover was not only interested in getting as much information as they could about Greg in terms of his mental and emotional state, as well as his current living arrangements. The user was keen on the finer details of the work right down to the final act. Your Last Lover reassured Greg she was dedicated to making his final moments as enjoyable as possible. This was a reciprocal experience, after all. She asked for an address by private message. Greg provided the necessary information. Then he was told to wait. On receiving this instruction, he had assumed that it would be a few days before she would get back to him. It was only a matter of hours. At 5 to midnight on a Tuesday evening, he received a private message from her. She would be at his apartment at 10 a.m. in the morning. She would be on time. He was instructed to drop whatever else he was doing and make arrangements for their meeting. Greg responded and agreed immediately, of course. His date with Destiny had been made.